Awesome. We are excited to welcome you all to our webinar today. Judson, thanks for joining me. Excited to talk about our topic today. Just as a brief introduction, this is part of our Innovation Spotlight webinar series, where we talk about how AI is impacting the human involvement in language testing. And my name is Brody Horton. I'm the Vice President of Customer Experience here at Emmersion. I'm joined today with one of our industry experts, Judson Hart, who is Director of Language Assessment here at Emmersion. Just a quick intro, and Judson, you can add anything to this, but Judson has spent the last about 16 years working in the language assessment industry, both in teaching, administration, as well as developing assessments. As Director of Language Assessments here at Emmersion, he advances our company strategy through developing and furthering all of our innovations. He leads our research and development team. And prior to joining Emmersion, he was the coordinator of assessment and technology at an English language center at Brigham Young University, which is one of the largest universities here in the United States, particularly around language assessment and language learning. So thanks for being with me here today, Judson.
Absolutely. I feel well introduced. Thank you.
Just as by kind of logistics, we would love to have questions come in throughout the webinar. Feel free to leave those in the chat. I'll be monitoring that. We'll try and weave those throughout and answer those. We'll also have some time at the end if you'd like. Just to kick things off a little bit, I want to go ahead and launch a poll. So if you see a poll on your screen, go ahead and answer that. It'll help guide our conversation today. Our conversation is really going to be focused around language assessment and human-rated assessments versus automated assessments, the pros and cons, the process behind those, and just understanding what you're currently doing today will help us guide that conversation. So I see a few answers coming in there on the poll, so appreciate the engagement and the participation there. To kind of tee this off and get it started, Judson, I want to start by asking you a question about your experience. You know, we talked about your background, and you've spent a lot of time before coming to Emmersion, actually probably more time on the human-rated evaluation side of things. How to conduct a human-rated interview, how to assess someone's language ability, with that style. Tell us, what does it take for somebody to go that route? What does it take to establish a process where you can do an interview style language assessment and be able to do it well?
Sure. And definitely, I think, I'm grateful that we're hitting this from both sides of what is often pitted as kind of a dichotomy. Either, you have a human assisted rated process or you have an AI enabled process. And I feel really fortunate in my background. The academic group that I was with really walked both sides of that fence very well. We continued to work on scalable assessment solutions that were automated, that made use of computerized technologies to understand language ability. But at the same time, we were within a humanities department, and there was a strong sense that for the sake of cost efficiency, for the sake of that interaction that's so valuable in language learning opportunities, we need to know how to give successful language interviews, scale those processes as to the extent possible. And so I do feel like I've been kind of uniquely prepared for this topic today because I have seen both sides. On the side of doing the human rated interview style language assessment well, I think the first thing is you have to understand and concede the inefficiency of it. A one-to-one interaction does not scale very well. It's going to take longer, and it's going to be able to do less in an amount of time than maybe the other kind of pressures would allow in a lot of instances. If we were to compare it to a tool, it's scissors. And scissors might be a great tool if you're working on your bonsai garden. But if you need to trim the football field, you're going to be at it for a long time, or you're going to need a lot more than just one pair of scissors to get that job done. So recognizing that there's inherent inefficiency, there's an inherent inability to scale human interviews is the right posture and position to take. Second thing I would say is you have to respect the complexity. It seems like a very simple thing. We have conversations all of the time. We interact with people. So we're just going to add on and kind of an extra thing to that interaction, this language evaluation step. The problem being is that that's a very unnatural addition to an interaction. It's something that we don't do often. Outside of like a language teaching or learning space, as I have a conversation with someone, I'm transferring and receiving meaning, but I'm not necessarily wrapped up in how it's being presented or the skillfulness with which someone's doing that. So kind of awakening that sense that's and adding it to a conversational interaction is really, it's much more complex linguistically, it's much more complex in cognitively than I think it's often respected to be. And recognizing that really there's two things that are happening. If I'm doing a human interview style assessment, that interviewer is expected to do two things. They're trying to extract language performance from the individual and simultaneously evaluate it as it's coming at them in real time, keeping the interaction going while at the same time making these judgments as it progresses. And that's really difficult to do simultaneously. And again, we've already addressed the inefficiency of it. And any way of getting around that complexity only increases the inefficiency.
Can I ask, just to clarify, when you say extract, these two things they're trying to do, extract the language performance and rate them, you're talking about if one person in the same setting is trying to, facilitate the conversation, right, and then also is trying to score them, that's where that, is that what you mean by that?
Exactly. In order for me to make a judgment about a person's language ability, they need to show me what they can do. That's going to, obviously they'll carry some of that burden, but it's going to be me that prompts them to the tasks that I want them to do that will demonstrate certain language skillfulness. And then I'll need to adjust my interview accordingly to the language performance that I'm getting from them. So it seems simple, but it's much more complex than it would seem.
What are the ways that you've accounted for that complexity of doing both of those things, or you've seen that accounted for?
Yeah, so on the performance solicitation side, that will come down to having more of a scripted interaction that allows for the cognitive load of carrying on the conversation to be a little bit easier. Again, with every kind of element of scriptedness you add to that interaction, it becomes less and less natural. So oftentimes what we'll see, if we need to have more of a human a human evaluated language measure, you'll take that performance aspect, you'll standardize it or computerize it so that instead of a live interactive interview, you have someone submitting answers to questions, and then those questions can be evaluated separately. So you really divorce those two steps. The language performance solicitation happens in one kind of mode, and then that language data is evaluated. And that separation is kind of what we see in a lot of these language assessments, like the TOEFL or the OPIC. Some of these things, they collect language performance sampling separate and then send it to language experts for review and analysis.
Just real quick, I see Matt posted in the chat that there's some people that are struggling to join. Alec, maybe you can check on that. Alec is here to help facilitate as well. And then Matt will, for everyone, will also be, we are recording this and can send it out. So in the event that they aren't able to join, hopefully we can get them the recording, but I hope they are able to join here. So you've highlighted a couple of things here about if you are going to do a human rated process, you need to be able to think through, how do you elicit that performance and then grade for it. Offered some suggestions about having a rubric and a consistent, interview guide. What are some of the other complexities that go into keeping a human rated process consistent and reliable and something that you can use?
Yeah, I think you need to play to human strengths when it comes to the evaluation. I think sometimes we think that in performing this type of evaluative task, that the human's going to approach it more like a machine They're going to say, okay, I've got 4 different elements of language performance that I need to account for, and I'm going to kind of additively create a total score in that performance. Where really humans don't evaluate that way. How a human's going to evaluate is they'll create a mental model that says, this is what I'm looking for. And then with the performance data that I'm given, I create a second model. It's what I'm using to evaluate. And I'm going to compare those 2 things and say, in this way, what I'm evaluating meets my mental model in these areas, is deficit to my mental model in this way. And we expect that mental model is a static and fixed entity, when really it's not. A lot goes into, and the rater is constantly forming and reforming and updating their mental model for what they're looking for, and as they're conducting this evaluation. And every kind of instance where they've performed that evaluation task then kind of modifies or adds to or takes away from the mental model. So it's definitely not staying fixed. And one of the things, so with your human raters, what you'll do is you'll go through processes of calibration, where everyone who's going to be evaluating language performance, or even if you just have one person who's going to do that, before they begin again to do that comparison or the review, they'll reconstruct and kind of recodify their mental model. But again, it's with every interaction, with every judgment that's made, I'm making these small shifts to my mental model, updates to my mental model. And then, I'll get a distracting text message, or, I'll start to think about lunch. And all of a sudden there's these threats to this process of evaluation that occur. So you're facing some stiff headwinds in keeping your raters true to kind of the language ideals that you're wanting them to be evaluating.
So to maybe play devil's advocate a little bit, we work with a lot of call centers, BPOs, staffing, recruiting firms that do this all day, every day, right? They have recruiters who have spent years, interviewing and assessing people for the job, and it's pretty consistent. And what we see frequently is, we have our recruiters who do this every day. We'll have them hop on a phone screen and have a phone conversation with them. We have to talk to them anyway. So we'll talk to them also in English, and we'll get a sense right then if they speak English well. And I speak English well, so I'll be able to know if they speak English well or not. It wouldn't, it's something we see that's very common. It's been used for a long time. Wouldn't a model like that work? And what are ways of where that might work or where it might not?
Yeah, and I mean, and you're correct, absolutely. It has been used for a long time, and used in part because that's all that there was, right? We were limited in anything other than an interview style interaction and doing language assessment. So I think that it's familiar, and that gives it a little bit more weight and accuracy, or perceived accuracy than we think it is. It's what we know best, and it's common. And I think, can a human interaction result in an effective language evaluation? Absolutely, it can, particularly if it's one in isolation. I think where we start to see a lot of the disruption is when we try to systematize it. And instead of just doing one, we start to do 30 or 40 in a single span. Again, humans aren't robotic. They get tired, they get distracted. Those pressures and stresses weigh in on their ability to notice, their ability to be consistent. And when we're looking at the mental model example of comparing to an ideal, a mental model can go 2 ways. You can look for what's similar between these 2 things, or what's different between these 2 things. And a rater doesn't necessarily have conscious control over that pivot. That's where you start to see raters' biases come in. And instead of looking for how does this match my mental model, we start to say, well, how is this different than my mental model? And when you look at human rated data, you start to see some of these patterns emerging, where raters aren't treating each evaluation as independent. They're being affected by the other things that are being rated. Raters aren't independent of draws on their time and their attention and their emotions, and you stop seeing the kind of the systematicity that you would expect as you try to scale a human style interaction.
Yeah, you and I were talking about a recent client, a large BPO client that you worked with recently to over I think it was an 18-month period of time looking at their human rated process. What did you find well that they were doing, or what steps did they try to undertake to make sure that the human rated evaluations that they were conducting were systematized, were consistent?
Yeah, so they had done a lot of the things we would expect them to do. They had gone through the process of creating a rubric that helps raters to true their mental model in the evaluation. They were clearly engaged in ongoing rater training. They were systematic in how they were conducting interviews. So it was clear that a process was being followed to kind of make it easier for raters to have similar performance data that was being evaluated. They were collecting the data in a systematic way so that they could review it after the fact. A lot of those, they were doing their best to have humans optimized for successful rating.
We're going to look a little bit at, I'm going to go ahead and share some of the data from this study, and remind me how large of a study group was this? Can you see that screen?
Several thousand, ultimately. I think just about 2,000 data samples were observed.
Talk us through what is this chart showing?
Sure.
And what is the evidence that we're seeing? We see here strong evidence of human bias. Maybe what does that bias sounds really negative? What does bias mean, and what is this evidence that we're seeing here?
So the way the language data came to us was divided between two groups. We had both groups were using the same language measure that had been created along with the same rubric, but it was being conducted in kind of two different groups or organizations within the company. One whose focus was on language and development, the others whose focus was talent acquisition. And despite having a fairly systematic approach to collecting the language performance data and then evaluating it, both of these groups were using the same rubric. They were using the same elicitation process and getting the language performance data. But when you look at this in terms of their shape, you notice two things. First, they're not the same. And our analysis showed that these should be considered as completely separate language measures, even though they were built the same, they were being executed in the same way. The way they're being executed, they're very different. And this waviness to the data, we would expect that if we had a handful of samples. When you start to measure things in the thousands, you expect that this would assume a very kind of normal or single peak shape that we would want it to have or expect it to have from an analysis perspective.
So we took the very same group of individuals that were rated by the human interview process and also applied an automated speaking test, the Emmersion speaking assessment. And what we talk us through what we're seeing here now, the comparison of the data.
Yeah, so from kind of a statistical presentation perspective, you start to see a tidiness and a normalness to the way the data is distributed. So again, at the scale that we were collecting observations at, you would start to see you should see a single peak emerging that has a similar shape. These two groups, again, that division still existed between the automated solution and the human rated solution. And we do observe some differences between these two groups. The talent acquisition group is a little bit higher in their ability. The language and development group is a little bit lower, but not nearly to the extent that we would have thought those two groups were the same when we look at the human rated process. And I think that kind of speaks to this point of one of the biases that a rater would bring to an evaluation is their context. Someone who's in talent acquisition is going to expect or be looking for those who they're evaluating to be hireable. Those who are in language and the language development team are going to expect that the person they're interacting with needs language development intervention. They're not making their judgments objectively. They're biased by that context. And that's what accounts for how sharply different in the output these two groups were.
Yeah, I think the other thing to point out is that the scale that the human rated evaluations were supposed to be measuring on was a 100-point scale, right? In theory. Yeah. What this next chart shows, talk us through what this is a demonstration of.
Yeah, and what this kind of shows is it shows the peaks that we were observing in the other plot, but it presents them in these vertical bands. So although the organization had designed a language evaluation that was intended to distribute performance across this 100-point scale, what we really see is that observations were being clustered around just the significant points or differences or bands in terms of outcome that the evaluation was meant to facilitate. So in what we really don't have a 100-point scale, we really have a 5-point scale. And that's why, while there's a few people that fall in between, the majority of people are being assigned a rating that are really just at those different cut points and thresholds. So it's clear that the human raters are looking to simplify the process of putting someone into a group, as opposed to the automated assessment that keeps the flexibility and the precision of a more precise discriminating scale intact during the collection of and analysis of the language performance data.
So, it's interesting. The reason why we wanted to share this data, as you and I talked about, is there hasn't been a lot of research comparing human rated evaluations and automated assessments. And this, few thousand data points really is a good sample size for somebody who's maybe still has some skepticism, and I am as well, about, all right, that's great that, in theory, the AI model scattered these points across this graph a little bit better. And, you designed the assessment so that it would spread them out on a curve. Well, but in practice, can the AI system, can an automated test actually do what a human can do? Can they have a conversation? Can they connect with the person? Can they understand? Can this person do the job?
Yeah, and I think we'll get into this even more detail. Like was mentioned at the beginning, not all automated solutions are the same, and that needs to be understood and respected. Some of the things that we're finding, though, is that as we increase the sophistication with which the automated solution is actually making real-time decisions and judgments and updates to what it's looking for based on the language input that it's getting, it starts to take some of those value, that value of having a dynamic human interaction, something that's growing or adjusting based on the language performance data that it gets. It starts to have some of those characteristics as well. So definitely we're seeing growth and development and an increase in sophistication of what these AI solutions are. I want to walk back a little bit and address, I think, where one thing that we were going for is kind of the why does it matter? Why does it matter that our human evaluation was really resulting in 5 groups rather than 100 points? What happens when we encounter a reason or to make a change? Let's say we get feedback that agent performance isn't what we wanted it to be. We need a higher caliber candidate that's advancing through our system. If we change that language expectation that we have, let's say we go from saying 85 is our acceptable score to 86. Well, because the assessment's not discriminating, that's not going to result in any change in our actual candidate flow. Or if we turn it down and we say we need more applicants or we need more candidates progressing through our system, the indiscrimination of our assessment isn't going to allow for those types of adjustments, those real-time updates to our expectations in our program. What we would have to reconstruct, retrain, reinvest in updating that mental model of our raters, and essentially we'd be starting from scratch again, which is hard to do and very expensive to do, and even then might not end up making the changes that you'd want it to have.
So if I understand that right, this idea you presented at the beginning of anybody trained to do a human language assessment well, they create a mental model for what they are expecting to see, and does the person they're interviewing match. If you want to adjust your expectations, or you need to, let's say in a call center setting, you need to adapt to the market conditions, that there's less talent available at that level, and you need to bring that down. You then have to go to all of those language evaluators and help them change that mental model to be able to get an accurate adjustment.
Right. And getting everyone to kind of pivot and change their expectations in the same direction and the right amount is really a hard thing to do, because all of the experience, all of your efforts to train them to look for one thing now fights against making those modifications. And I think anyone that's worked with human raters would have observed some of that resistance to change that you'd find within your language evaluation team. Whereas
an AI model doesn't have this set fixed model that it's looking at, but rather it has it's evaluating on a breadth and giving everybody a distinct ability score that then you can just adjust, what your passing score is, and without needing to adjust the model. Is that right?
Absolutely. Yep. And, we're not fighting against any of the limitations to future growth and development too. We expect that the automated solution is going to naturally be improved over time. Whereas humans are going to continue kind of at the level of performance that we've seen them at in the past. They're human.
So you've been doing language assessment for longer than AI and automated solutions have been available. How do you merge the two? What are humans really good at? What is AI better at? We've talked a little bit about that. And how do you best work them to use both of their strengths in a way that fits the process still?
Yeah. So, walking back a little bit to an earlier experience that I had, I was part of an intensive English language program that every semester we'd need to essentially screen or place students into the level of coursework that they would be enrolled in for that semester. And we had, a few days was all that we had before we needed to have those placement decisions made, so we could get people enrolled and we could take care of administrative duties that were assigned, that had implications in the placements assessments that would be made. And so we had developed a suite of automated assessments that enabled us to do that process within a single morning of the 3 days that people were available. The sooner we got that data, the better it was for us as a program. And we had previously had an interview component as part of that. And so as we started to evaluate, are we keeping this interview component? Why would we keep this interview component? It was, let's definitely keep it, but let's move it, 2 days now after we've taken care of the administrative assignment of deciding which level this person fits in, because then we can take a little bit longer time for the interviews. Our process isn't being slowed by the inefficiency of the interview component. And instead of having these interviews need to have this element of assessment and evaluation that can change kind of the tenor of that interaction, we can keep it much more open, much more human, much more interested in the person and helping that person to be interested in us as an organization than it was possible to do when that interview needed to provide this unreliable language evaluation component. So I think, again, as I see it, an interview is a great opportunity for you to find out things that aren't measurable by a language assessment. What is that person's personability? How quickly, how warm are they? We don't have an assessment of that really important critical piece. The computer can't measure that well yet. So let's have the humans measure some of those things that are important to understand, but that they're the best that we have at doing that.
Yeah. We just have about 1 minute left. Any questions that anyone has, please feel free to throw those in the chat. We can answer those here for a couple of minutes. I just wanted to say, we've talked a lot about humans and AI and the different processes. not all AI is created equal. Not all automated assessments are created equal. We would love you to be able to, take our assessment, the Emmersion assessment, so you can try it for yourselves, get a feel for it, get comfortable with it. We'll be sending out a link to that to take an assessment, as well as, as a thank you for coming, a link to download our latest ebook, which is about optimizing your bilingual hiring volume with humans and AI. So we'll send both of those to you, to everybody that attended. If there are any questions, we have, just 1 or 2 more minutes, we can hang on and answer those, but we appreciate everybody coming today. One question that's coming in here: what is the name of the assessment? Have you had any legal challenges related to this? So Emmersion is the name of our company. We call our assessments the Emmersion speaking assessment. We have a writing assessment as well. It's the Emmersion writing assessment. We do have a custom proprietary scoring scale that we call True North. And so sometimes the assessments get confused and are referred to as the True North assessment. Judson, what are your thoughts about the legal challenges related to automated assessments?
Yeah, I think there's certainly, when you're collecting information and data from someone, there's certain new expectations for how that data is collected. When it comes to legal challenges, I look at, how fair do we want to make our hiring process? I have a lot more confidence in our solution evaluating someone's language ability in a fair and reliable way than I do in a lot of these interview style assessments. So strictly on the grounds of fairness, I have a lot of confidence in the solution that we've come up with.
Yeah, we hear that a lot from diversity and inclusion specialists at organizations, where they are all for removing the human rated process because there's so much, evidence about, bias, discrimination, potential, legal parameters there. The legal challenges we have seen have been, more around personal information. And our system is built in a way to design to be, compliant with all of the various laws, GDPR, the laws that are out there in various countries and governments, to protect that information in a way that is very safe and it's, proprietary to that individual. So thank you for asking that question. I think that's about it. We're going to wrap up. One more question before we go on: how effective is AI-based evaluation when it comes to evaluating offshore candidates with an American ear? So in other words, how do candidates respond using the local colloquial word, usage, tone, accent, regional dialect, that type of thing? Judson, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I think what we see is that our AI assessment is really, really perceptive and consistent in how it evaluates linguistic features. Again, in terms of noticing things, it notices everything when it comes to the sounds and the structures and the patterns that the person's using. It's a lot more perceptive and consistent in evaluating a person on their linguistic forms and features than a human ever would be. Certainly, when we start to talk about, like, what I'm hearing here is how do they respond? Do they respond to it in a way that's as nuanced as we need them to be to do our work? That's maybe one of those elements where a secondary measure or a secondary layer of interacting with a human and getting that read on personability and responsiveness would be a really great way of sequencing an AI assessment with a human rated process.
Yeah, and in my practice, consulting with our clients on this, directly, is that often what they're looking for is they're worried that the assessment will score incorrectly because of accent or bias, and the speech recognition tools that we use, like you said, are very open and sensitive to all, accents, tones, colloquial words, that type of thing, so that you don't have, I guess your score is not negatively impacted because of those elements. So,
yeah. And again, you can dial up or dial down depending on the context and the need to create a more open approach to who's being hired, or a more narrow focused approach on, the highest ends of the ability scale that we screen for.
Yeah. And Ronald has, one follow-up question, and then we'll end. That said, we'd love to chat with you more about each of these questions individually. So let's let this be the start to the conversation for anyone who does have questions around correlating scores to job performance. And then Ronald's follow-up question about calibrating specifically with clients. Just one quick element there. We do correlate our scores and the ability, we invite all of our clients to provide performance data. And Judson and our team of researchers can take that and from a psychometric perspective, be able to calibrate specifically to a job role or a client or a specific performance expectation, and then dial that in and give a specific recommendation that if you're looking to hire for this client, this client's needs, or to expect this level of performance, you need them to score within this range. And so we do offer that custom calibration and that custom ability to tailor the recommendations based on the expected performance in the job. So we appreciate everyone's time today. Again, we'll be following up with an email with a link to take the assessment and our ebook. Please reach out to us as well if you have any other follow-up questions. And Judson, thank you for taking so much time to answer all.
Yeah, look forward to next chats.
Thanks, everyone.